Can you give an overview of the structure of the Iranian political system for someone who has no understanding of it? Like, basically, why is it an interesting topic?
Well, it's interesting because even those who spend many years studying it still find it very complex. It's interesting because it's still pretty much an experimental state system. It's not really based in any form of Iranian political tradition. It blends together effectively what was until 1979 a fringe peripheral doctrine of Shiism, the Vilayat al-Faqih, or the oversight of the prominent religious jurists over the state system. And then the nuts and bolts of the state system really derived from the French Fifth Republic model. And that was because when Khomeini was in Paris and the final stages of the revolution of 78, 79, he asks one of his advisors to start working on the constitution because it was becoming evident that the Shah was on his the last phase of his rule. And that advisor happened to be a French-trained sociologist and a Francophile of sorts. And he had a very strong interest in the French Fifth Republic structure. And that really stuck. And that is the origin of the presidency as you see it today in the Islamic Republic. So it's a hybrid experimental state system which was subject to severe change after the death of Khomeini in 1989 as well. And it's interesting to note how the extent to which the constitution in 1989 was revised because of Khomeini's death. So it does also have this challenge and issue of how to fit the personalities which run the state.
Okay. So what are the main institutions of the Iranian political system?
Well, for sure, the main one is the office of the Supreme Leader and the Supreme Leader himself, who has a considerable amount of powers, some of them very precisely defined in the Constitution. For example, I think the Iranian Constitution must be one of the very few in the world which states that the most senior authority of the land has the duty to appoint the head of the radio television. This is specified explicitly in the Constitution, which is, as I said, a rarity. And he exercises his power through formal and informal means. Then, obviously, the presidency, formally second in the pecking order of power. And the presidency in Iran is this anomaly. It's the only non-ceremonial presidency in the world, I think, that is not simultaneously the highest authority of the land. Usually, non-ceremonial presidencies are the most powerful figure of the republic. And then come other important bodies, the Guardian Council, for example, which from the 90s has the duty and the role of pretty much exerting a full supervision over all stages of any election, national election. And I think the parliament in Iran is a much weaker institution related to all of these.
So what are the limits on the power of the president, firstly?
Well, the president's constitutionally is not the most powerful figure. The supreme leader is.
What power does he actually have in that case?
Well, his power is we can sum up that his power is more that of exerting influence over main traits of state policy. For example, you could argue that if you look at the whole nuclear crisis from 2003 to the present day, it has been influenced to a great extent by the sitting president. For example, the Ahmadinejad era was one in which Iran really distanced itself from the West, and then the recent nuclear deal of 2015 was in no small measure due to the agenda of President Rouhani. But of course, it was not them doing it directly. There had to be a blessing of sorts of the supreme leader on any line that the country was pursuing on the nuclear issue. So the president influences. The president, of course, has a considerable role in the day-to-day administration of the country because it is him who selects most of the ministers. Some of them are on the purview of the supreme leader. And the president is, of course, the public face of the system as well. He's the one who really has to bear the brunt when the economy goes down, or bask in the success when there is a positive sort of trend. So he is. a figure that is not really directly comparable to the French role model or other presidencies, but at the same time a significant figure in the state establishment.
So, are there any limits on the power of the supreme leader?
Well, the supreme leader technically is subject to the supervision of the Assembly of Experts that has to, I think, meet up every 6 months, and is a body that appoints him in a conclave of sorts. But in practice, this element of supervision has not really been carried out in recent years. The body has just rubber-stamped Khamenei's tenure. So the way things are right now, the supreme leader the supreme leader's powers are effectively unchecked. Now, whether Khamenei exercised unchecked authority in all layers of the state, well, this is debatable. You could argue that he's amenable to listening in some aspects and has a more direct, more consistent position on some other issues.
And how has the role of supreme leader evolved over time?
Well, there are some differences in the way Khomeini and Khamenei interpreted the position of the supreme leader. Khomeini, of course, became supreme leader aged 80 or so. He wasn't somebody who was very eager to engage in the day-to-day trappings and management of the state of state activities. So, for example, constitutionally, he was supposed to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but he kept delegating this position to other figures until 1989. He also had less of a presence in the lower rungs of the state. Khamenei appears to have a far more hands approach. He really, for example, has never relinquished the role of commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He has a more granular presence in all echelons of the state, and he's very consistent in some aspects. For example, if you look at his policy regarding the United States, his perennial distrust of the United States and his belief that Iran really cannot do business with any U.S. administration, well, that really goes back to the 80s. Really, it has slightly shifted here and there, but there's remarkable consistency in his position.
So, how was Khamenei? How did Khamenei become supreme leader, and how did he establish himself in that role?
Well, he became supreme leader by virtue of the fact that the long-running sort of crown prince of sorts, successor to Khomeini, Ayatollah Montazeri, had fallen into disgrace a few months before Khomeini's death, and there was no clear successor. And then his main political ally, Hashemi Rafsanjani, was then Majlis, the parliament speaker, and the arbitrator of sorts of the political scene, felt that with him becoming supreme leader, he could fulfill his role of becoming a very strong president and pulling through with the reconstruction and the stabilization of the country after the very turbulent first decade between 79 and 89.
So, I think the figure of Rafsanjani is a very interesting political figure, and he kind of says a lot about Iran's political system and its political development. So, how did he? Can you talk about him, for his background for a little bit, and then his political position?
Yes, well, Rafsanjani was probably one of the few real, through and through politicians of the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic has had many amateur politicians. For example, Ahmadinejad, I think, was a good example of this. Yes, an engineer that developed a vocation in politics, but didn't really manage to act as a through and through politician. But Rafsanjani was. Rafsanjani, as all politicians, went through a whole litany of victories and defeats, almost in equal measure. You could argue that he was on the rise again towards the end of his life, but he went through a very humiliating period between 2009 and 2013-14, when his main nemesis, Ahmadinejad, won that very contested elections in 2009, and the authority of his family and some of his kids were actually put into jail. Rafsanjani was an early follower of Khomeini. He was known for political activity in the 60s and 70s, went in jail for spells at that point in time. And from the beginning, he was always a dynamic politician, ready to push the envelope and go for very controversial positions. So, for example, in the mid-70s, there is some evidence that he was in favor of a rapprochement between the radical Mujahideen Khalq and Khomeini. He was trying to persuade Khomeini to accept them as a genuine element of his kind of opposition to the Shah. In the 80s, he goes through a phase at the beginning where he is very virulently anti-American in the early 80s. But then in the mid-80s, he realizes that the Islamic Republic's stability really cannot be guaranteed until there is a sort of understanding or rapprochement of sorts with the United States. So we have both the Iran-Contra affair, but then an aspect which hasn't really been focused on. In the first part of his presidency, 89 to 93 actually, there was a discreet but very visible resumption of trade between Iran and the United States. So much so that by 1993, the biggest quantity of oil exported by Iran was actually to American oil companies, 24%. Rafsanjani's whole process of stabilizing the Islamic Republic via a stabilization of the relationship with the United States, which was proceeding very tentatively under Bush Sr., was really derailed by Clinton. Clinton and the Helms-D'Amato Act of 1994 really put a brake on that. And that was one of the main turning points of Rafsanjani. He was unable really to fix the economy and fix inflation, and his second term was really dogged by economic malaise.
And what was Rafsanjani's relationship to political reform? Because he clearly was, I don't know if you could describe him as a reformist, but he did make overtures during the Green Movement of 2009.
Yes, Rafsanjani never really stuck to a very well-defined political ideology. He was a very dynamic figure who could, in an agile way, really go and stick with political factions and ideologies which benefited him most at different times. So, by his own admission, he did not vote for Khatami in the 1997 election. He voted for the mainstream conservative candidate, Natek Nouri, and then receded into in the ranks of rather robust conservative opposition to Khatami after his failed election to parliament in the year 2000. But then by 2005, he suddenly managed to turn the cards again and turn the tide and become a sort of a moderate, elderly politician. In 2009, he was at the helm of the opposition to Ahmadinejad, and from then onwards, he remained a sort of a lukewarm moderate. He wasn't a reformist in the sense that he never really proposed anything substantial on how the political system should be reformed. But from around 2005 onwards, he held very liberal, at times, views on society. But at the same time, he remained a regime loyalist, and he remained a steadfast supporter of the whole founding principles of the Islamic Republic. His relationship with Khamenei was very frayed from 2009 onwards, but he maintained a working relationship with him. You know, Khatami didn't. Khatami really fell out completely with Khamenei after 2009 and still pays the price of that. Rafsanjani managed to keep a working relationship with Khamenei and managed to keep himself within the fold of the political system and not at the very edges of it, like Khatami did.
Well, I'd like to discuss President Khatami. So, fundamentally, who was he?
Well, Khatami was again, I wouldn't really classify him as a professional politician. He was a long-standing member of parliament. He came from a very prominent and very well-regarded clerical family of the city of Yazd. After the revolution, he, as I said, was a member of parliament. He served as culture minister during the Rafsanjani period, and that's when he made a reputation for himself for a more relaxed attitude towards Islamic mores, especially in the public industry. And he was famously forced off in the early 90s, the position as culture minister, goes to the National Library as its head, and there he has a sort of an epiphany. By spending a lot of time reading texts on Western political philosophy in particular, he develops an idea that the West isn't something that should be just condemned and sort of thrown away altogether, but there are parts of Western political philosophy which make sense. And in a very guarded way, one could pick and choose aspects of Western political traditions and bring them into the Iranian case. And that's what it sought to do, but it wasn't really well organized, and he didn't really have a cogent answer when the conservatives from around, I would say, 1999 to 2000 really started to push hard together with Khamenei to rein in the reformists, because they were sort of afraid that they would either get too much power or they would in some way find a synergy with outside forces, particularly American, and in this way really cause a threat to their position within the state system. And Khatami really didn't have any form of reply to it, and he started a very long lame duck period, I would say, from around 2001 onwards, which really resulted in his second term being hobbled by his inability to really rise to the conservative challenge.
So does the experience of Khatami show that like proper political reform within Iran is impossible within the system that exists currently?
Well, we have to bear in mind that Iran is still hasn't gone through a generational change, meaning that the generation that is currently in power in Iran, at least at its upper crust, is the generation that was there when Khomeini took power in 1979. They fought in the war. So the whole vision of the Islamic Republic, its role in the world and in the political system more, is completely shaped by these two episodes, the revolution and the war. As these two episodes become more and more memory and go more and more into history rather than being a contemporary event, then we will need to see to what extent, for example, allegiance to different interpretations of Khomeini's role, or Khamenei himself, or this sort of new forms of nationalism which has taken over and justifies Iran's continued presence in Syria and sort of activities in the Middle East. All of this needs to be seen, and all of this needs to be seen as to when the generation which does not have a living memory of the revolution or the war will rise to political power in the next couple of decades. If the Islamic Republic still is existent in its current structures, then we will need to see whether really reform is possible. At the moment, with the current generation, I think that reform has hit an obstacle, and reform as intended by Khatami 20 years ago has become a bit of a stale process and is not really moving forward.
Well, okay, so back to Khatami again. I think his administration, for many, is seen in terms of its failures. What would you see as his successes?
Well, Khatami definitely opened up Iran to the outside world. I mean, Iran was in a really hermit state almost before Khatami got to power in 1997. He ended up in several very prominent international gatherings, the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he was a very prominent speaker at the UN. He enabled many younger Iranians to see their ancestral homeland for the first place. He sort of put Iran on the map. Mm-hmm. And then he also, for at least a period between 97 and 99, allowed a critical semi-independent media to flourish. Of course, he couldn't really defend this media when it started to be repressed and continuously banned. But at least for a couple of years, there was an opening up of the strictures which had been in place before that in the publishing sectors, in the press. People became more engaged in politics. They became more interested in politics and history and in contemporary events. So he also brought some end to the apathy as well. And he really kick-started this, I think, chain of thought on whether the Islamic Republic is really potentially subject to modification or not, or whether it has to really be ruled as the leader wishes.
Okay, so following the Khatami's presidency, you had the 2005 elections, and those were the first elections which also led to a runoff between Rafsanjani, who we mentioned earlier, and Ahmadinejad. So can you tell me a little bit about these elections and about Ahmadinejad, the eventual winner?
Yes, well, Iranians will always tell you that, they've always been at the forefront of many inventions of mankind. So probably an Iranian talking to you today will say that all this populism that you see all around the world, be it of the Trump, Salvini, or Nigel Farage, or any other variety, really has a sort of a initial stage with Ahmadinejad. Of course, I don't think this is a very accurate analogy, but Ahmadinejad in some way, there are some elements of his success in 2005 which really rings a bell with some populists other ways. It's the sheer sense of fatigue of the electorate towards the existing state system.
Because Rafsanjani was kind of the emblem of that.
As a sort of a self-perpetuating circle of people who engage in a game of musical chairs, pretty much. The choice is there, of course. You don't have a plebiscite, an old school Syrian style plebiscite where there's only one candidate and that candidate gets 99%. So you're giving a choice at the ballot box, but that choice is between people who keep recycling themselves, which ironically is more or less what happened in 2013. But in 2005 there was just this penchant for something different, and the candidate field was quite broad. But Ahmadinejad had made a reputation for himself in the mayoralty in Tehran as being different. People weren't actually clear on the fact that he didn't have a very good grip on the whole international political scene and more. But he was really seen as somebody who, first of all, was not a cleric. Second of all, did not have all the suave, all the sort of nouveau riche elements of the upper clergy and the clear comfort of their lives. And he had this very ultra-populist agenda, which some of it was and remains very outrageous. But
How so outrageous?
Well, he famously said that he was ready to bring the oil dividends to the sofre, or the tablecloth that Iranians traditionally put on their rugs to have a communal meal, for example. Or talked about entering the forbidden precinct of power, or made very outlandish claims about giving all manners of money dividends, of sort of financial support to families. Now, ironically, if you look at the new Italian government that came into place recently, and they keep on going about the citizenship salary, pretty much, which is which is a sort of variant of what Ahmadinejad actually more or less did in the second term, when he scrapped subsidies and gave out cash payments to people. So all of this was there, but of course at the same time Ahmadinejad had a very rudimentary understanding of international politics, international diplomacy. He effectively scuppered all the goodwill that Khatami had generated during this period vis-a-vis the West. He touched upon very sensitive points, such as the extent of the Holocaust, or the fact that Israel needs to be relocated, or And all these things that really were, of course, amplified by the media because there were great sound bites. And he would doggedly go on American television networks just defending his line. And all this, coupled with the fact that the Iranian nuclear program started having a twist towards Iran's isolation and the inability to strike a deal with the West, which was partially driven by his persona but also his politics. The result was that the Iranian economy as a whole suffered, especially in his second term, and then in the second term he became embroiled in a really rigid fight with his conservative opponents that completely paralyzed his government.
I'd be interested in this relationship between Ahmadinejad and Khamenei, because he comes in as this kind of anti-elitist populist, but then he, at least in the 2009 elections, he very much becomes the candidate of Khamenei.
Yes. In 2009, eventually Khamenei confirms the election results, which were very controversial, resulting in his outright victory over Mousavi, and I witnessed them in Tehran, and Mousavi seemed really in a good shape. He really seemed capable of winning, maybe even at the first round. Khamenei did this because of his very old rivalries with Mousavi going back to the 80s, and the fact that he was certain that he couldn't work with Mousavi himself. And of course the fact that Ahmadinejad seemed like a pliant president, which he wasn't. He started fighting with conservative opponents straight after the election. He was very dogged in his cabinet choices, and all this resulted in the progressive fraying of his even, I think, personal relationship with Khamenei, which never really recovered. And the most important impact of all of this was the inability of his faction to propose a candidate for the 2013 elections, and by the fact that in 2017, when he attempted himself to run for the presidency, he was actually disqualified by the Council of Guardians. And that marks the second time in which the Council of Guardians disqualified a former president, Rafsanjani being the first one. So there is this sort of Guardian Council devouring its own candidates syndrome that, of course, all of these have been previously approved. And it is remarkable to think that somebody who was previously cleared for the office and held the office for 8 years suddenly is deemed to be unsuitable for the very task.
Yes, I think there's been an analysis which has found that the proportion of people being disqualified has been going up every election. Why do you think that in 2009 Mousavi was allowed to run?
Well, Mousavi's stature within the state system was very high. He had a very high level of support within the establishment, even because he was at repeated times when Mousavi clashed with Khamenei or with others during the 80s, Khomeini would repeatedly take his position. And it would have been very difficult for him to be disqualified, even because it was very difficult to find any form of a real infringement of him towards all the rules. Regarding the fact that there's a never increasing number of disqualifications, this is also due to the fact that registering for Iranian presidential elections has become a sort of a national pastime for many, because there's no need to have a minimum number of signatures or petitions or anything. One can simply show up at the Interior Ministry and sign up, and then the Guardian Council goes through a sifting process and gets rid of 99% of candidates.
The 2009 elections, I think, were pretty transparently manipulated. Do we have details about other elections that we can trust the results of them?
Well, it's at times very difficult to gauge the accuracy of Iranian electoral results. But one thing that stands out is that these results are rarely altered, if at all. So any election once called, there is no, if you want, a posteriori tampering with results. So whatever adjustment, if any, occurs at the counting stage, pretty much. So, of course, when analyzing the Iranian state system, you're in a way bound to go with the official results. But with this caveat that, maybe a few decades down the line, if archives become accessible in Iran, a different picture could emerge. This is, of course, one of the limitations of working with contemporary history.
I'd like to, quickly talk about political parties in Iran, because I think it's quite an unusual system in that it's kind of got a competitive, semi-democratic system, but it doesn't have strong political parties in the same way that we'd understand them. Why do you think that this is?
Well, first of all, there are no political parties that are separate from the state, pretty much. So it's the state elite that makes the political parties. Practically all the political parties that are officially operating, have a license to operate formally, have a foothold within the state. So that is one aspect of it. The other one is that political party tradition in Iran has always been very weak. The only political party which really emerged and had an operation as a political party was the Tudeh party. Branches across the country, occasionally competing in elections, remaining outside the state, and for a very brief period being in government, but often being without. This sort of, the Islamic Republic did toy with coming out with a more or less single-party state system in the Islamic Republic Party in the 80s, but that was folded because it was really they were really unable to maintain internal party unity. So what you see really is a sort of a universal recognition that the political party experience in modern Iran and in the Islamic Republic in particular is one that has had limited success.
I think Iran is very unusual because as I said, it's a kind of semi-democratic country, but it does have a strong competitive element in its political system. Why did this develop?
Well, it did develop because Khomeini never, first of all, ran a party, and then his own views were quite lax on many aspects. So when it comes to the economy, for example, it was possible to have a very almost etatist or socialistic view on the economy on the one side, but on the other side of the spectrum, you could have a very laissez-faire and semi-capitalist approach. In foreign policy, you could have people who were in favor of even establishing ties with the United States and people who were willing to oppose. Because you don't have anything akin to Mao's Little Red Book or Gaddafi's Green Book or any other ideological text that really sets the limits and sets the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's inside the Islamic Republic. And this sort of flexibility has led to this sort of unique factionalism that you see in the Islamic Republic and this variety of views and opinions and positions on very key issues.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the future of the Islamic Republic. So I think it's fair to say that it's been through a lot of challenges since the revolution and is likely to go through further challenges in the future. How sustainable do you think that the government is?
Well, I mean, with the proviso that, of course, my job is analyzing the past rather than the future. I think the big challenge on the horizon for the Islamic Republic, beyond shorter-term ones, which I'll come to in a moment, is this issue of generational change. Is to see what really happens when the founding fathers go away from the scene, and we have this new generation emerging with little direct association with Khomeini. Ahmadinejad was this anomaly. He was the only president who really did not have any meaningful direct interaction with Khomeini. Ironically, his successor had far more interaction with Khomeini, Rouhani, than he did. And it needs to be seen how this issue is going to really impact the Islamic Republic moving forward, as natural causes really imply the generational change. Generational change has been implemented much better in scenarios where the founding generation has bowed out. Look at China or even Cuba recently. Because of, for example, the existence of a party organization which could really produce the younger generation. This production of the younger generation has been more haphazard in Iran. I mean, at times you feel that the Islamic, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, are sort of behind it. They are creating a younger generation. The reformists are not as successful, and the conservatives really needs to be seen. I think in the shorter term, the main issue is that Iran needs to really reach a conclusion over its relationship with the West, over its nuclear program, whether the costs of the nuclear program, these sort of sanctions, which one school of thought to some extent correctly defines as unfair and unbalanced, but they're there, and all the other costs associated with the nuclear program really sort of are outweighed by the benefits. We hear very little about the benefits of the nuclear program, but hear a lot about the costs and the potential threats and so on and so forth. Over the past few years, actually, after the end, ironically, of the Ahmadinejad presidency, Iran has developed a real problem with its neighbors. Saudi Arabia in particular, but also other Arab countries, and this situation, its relationship with the Arab world really needs a rethink, where possible, of course, because part of the problem is the virulence with which Saudi Arabia is really acting in an anti-Iranian fashion at the moment. And of course, the other issue is how to deal with this very burgeoning younger population. A good majority of Iranians are age 35 or less, and there is not just the issue of how to build enough jobs, obviously, to be able to place them in the productive sectors, especially because of big increases in further and higher education that we've had in Iran over the past few decades, but also to what extent can these people retain a sense of loyalty towards the Islamic Republic, given that, again, they don't have experience of these seminal moments in the past. And to what extent does, for example, do forms of nationalism which have emerged in recent years, which are sort of sidestepping a bit the religious element, assist in this regard?
And one last thing, what most surprised you when you were researching into this issue of the presidency and the political system of modern Iran?
Well, the presidency in modern Iran seems to be like a continuous work in progress. And when we analyze Western systems, we are used to some element of tradition and ritual and recurrence and stability kicking in. Of course, there are some twists and turns. I think that Donald Trump is really, for example, seeking to redefine the role of the president, but within some limits. What is really striking with regards to the Iranian presidency is the extent to which personal traits, cultural traits, the very demeanor or the very attitude of the president really shapes the institution for the period in which that president is charged. In my view, it does that more than, say, the personality of a British prime minister affects the prime minister position in Britain, or for that matter, the personality of a French president affects the presidency in France. And really, we have really gotten to the point that despite having said that the presidency is not the more powerful element of the state, it is now really becoming a recurrence in both analytical circles or academic scholarly circles, and even within the general populace, to really define political eras in the Islamic Republic with the terms in office of various presidents. So people really don't make really a distinction between Khomeini and Khamenei as supreme leader anymore eras, but they say, for example, Mousavi's tenure as prime minister, Ahmadinejad's tenure, Rouhani's tenure. Prices were much better, were much lower during, say, the first part of Khatami's period, while of course omitting the fact that Iran is not a fully presidential system, and there are many other moving parts to this.
Okay. One last question about the succession of the supreme leader, because currently there doesn't seem to be a single unified candidate, and Khamenei is getting older and older. What do you think is likely to happen when Khamenei dies?
Well, one of the reasons why we don't know much about what's happening is that all the potential candidates are getting older as Khamenei gets older. So, for example, for quite a few years, there was talk of Hashemi Shahrudi, the former head of the judiciary, being a very sort of high-level, very talked-after choice to become the successor to Khamenei. Well, he's very sick now with cancer, and he's being knocked out. And many of even the people who are either contemporaries of Khamenei or slightly younger than him are really feeling the brunt of age. So that is another real enigma. I don't think it's very easy for him to bring about a blood succession. So, for example, push forward one of his sons who is a member of the clergy, because they don't quite have, I think, the qualities that he had when he became leader. Last year, one candidate who was considered to be potentially someone who could have been in the driving seat to become the supreme leader, Ibrahim Raisi, ran for presidency, but his sort of whole campaign floundered so badly that I'm not really sure whether he has the ability to pick up again and enter this sort of race. So we really don't know, and part of this unknown is the fact that as Khamenei's, of course, Khamenei's tenure will come to an end at some point, but he's soldiering on, and his tenure turns 30 next year, and that's 3 times the period in office of, well, actually over 3 times the period of office shortly, a little over 3 times the period of office of Khomeini. So the longer he stays in office, and the longer this generational change is delayed, the more the sort of candidates that could have taken over sort of fade out from the scene.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.